Late in the summer of 1945, on the edge of a quiet dispersal airfield in northern England, rows of four-engined aircraft sat motionless. Their tires slowly lost pressure. Rain pooled along the seams of aluminum skin. Inside the cockpits, dust settled on throttle levers that had once been pushed forward over Germany, the Atlantic, and the Arctic. Ground crews walked past without stopping. No engines were warmed. No orders arrived. These machines had survived the war. Yet something else was happening to them now. They were being forgotten. Only weeks earlier, these aircraft had still been part of an active bomber force. Crews had flown them on final operations, training flights, transport missions, and supply runs. Now, with the war in Europe over and Japan nearing surrender, they were being parked in fields, lined up on concrete aprons, or ferried to storage sites. Their fate was unclear. They were intact, flyable, and numerous. Yet there was no plan to keep most of them. This moment marked the beginning of the post-war story of Britain's Halifax bombers. By mid-1945, the Second World War had reached its conclusion in Europe. Germany surrendered on the 8th of May. The Royal Air Force suddenly found itself with an enormous fleet built for a conflict that no longer existed. During the final year of the war, Bomber Command alone operated thousands of heavy aircraft. Among them was the Handley Page Halifax, one of Britain's three principal four-engined heavy bombers alongside the Lancaster and the Stirling. The Halifax had entered frontline service in 1941. Born from pre-war specifications that demanded long-range, heavy payload and the ability to operate at night. By 1944, improved variants had corrected early shortcomings in performance and handling. Halifax squadrons flew bombing operations over occupied Europe, mine-laying sorties in coastal waters and special missions with airborne forces. They towed gliders on DID, dropped paratroops over Normandy and the Rhine, and carried supplies to resistance movements. When the war ended, more than 6,000 Halifax aircraft had been built across multiple marks. Hundreds were still operational. Many were less than 2 years old. Yet Britain, in 1945, faced severe economic strain, a rapidly shrinking defense budget, and a strategic shift away from mass bomber fleets. The question was not how to use these aircraft, but how quickly to dispose of them. At its wartime peak, Halifax production involved factories across Britain, Canada, and the Commonwealth. Assembly lines at Handley Page, English Electric Routes, and ferry turned out aircraft at a rate exceeding 100 per month during 1943 and 1,944. Each Halifax required tens of thousands of man-hours for Rolls-Royce, Merlin, or Bristol Hercules engines. And large quantities of aluminum alloy, steel, wiring, and instrumentation. The aircraft itself spanned over 31 meters, weighed more than 29 tons fully loaded, and carried crews of 7. Airfields had been expanded to accommodate its wingspan and takeoff run. Training pipelines produced thousands of pilots, navigators, bomb aimers, wireless operators, gunners, and flight engineers, specifically for heavy bomber operations. By August 1945, this entire system was obsolete. Britain could not afford to maintain it. The country faced rationing, industrial reconversion, and a massive national debt. Military planners no longer saw a need for thousands of piston-engined bombers designed for night area bombing. Jet propulsion was already emerging. Nuclear weapons would soon redefine strategic bombing. The Halifax, despite its wartime service, had no clear peacetime role at scale. The process of winding down began almost immediately. Squadrons were disbanded or merged. Aircraft were flown to maintenance units, where they were inspected, cataloged, and placed into storage categories, more earmarked for temporary retention. Most were not. The breakdown followed a structured pattern. First came withdrawal from frontline units. Aircraft with higher hours, battle damage, or older airframes were grounded first. Engines were removed if still serviceable. Instruments, radios, and armament were stripped. What remained was an empty airframe, still imposing in size but already hollowed out. Next came concentration at disposal airfields. Locations such as RAF Elvington, RAF Kemble, and RAF Silloth, filled with rows of Halifax bombers, parked wingtip to wingtip. From the air, these sites appeared as vast metallic grids. On the ground, crews performed minimal maintenance, just enough to prevent immediate deterioration while decisions were finalized. A smaller number of aircraft were selected for conversion rather than destruction. Some Halifax variants were modified into transport aircraft, designated Halifax C-8 and later civilian marks. Bomb bays were sealed or repurposed. Defensive armament was removed. Seating and cargo fittings were installed. These aircraft served briefly with RAF Transport Command, moving personnel, freight, and mail across Europe and the Middle East during the immediate post-war period. Others found new roles at sea. The Halifax proved adaptable for maritime patrol and search and rescue duties. Coastal Command operated modified versions equipped with radar, depth charges, and lifeboat dropping gear. In the North Atlantic, a handful of Halifaxes continued flying into the late 1940s, scanning for distress signals rather than submarines. A very limited number entered civilian airline service. Companies such as British South American Airways and various charter operators used converted Halifaxes for freight and passenger routes. These aircraft were noisy, inefficient, and expensive to operate compared to emerging civilian transports. But they filled a temporary gap during the shortage of purpose-built airliners. Even with these conversions, the numbers were small. They accounted for only a fraction of the total fleet. The majority of Halifax bombers had no future beyond dismantling. Allied investigators and technical teams inspected representative aircraft as part of post-war surveys. These examinations were not conducted to preserve the Halifax, but to assess British wartime production standards, maintenance practices, and operational wear. Reports noted the aircraft's rugged construction and adaptability, but also its complexity and high operating cost. Compared to newer designs under development, the Halifax was already outdated. There was no political or cultural movement to preserve heavy bombers in large numbers. At the time, they were seen not as historic artifacts, but as tools of a brutal war that Britain was eager to leave behind. Museums were few. Storage was expensive. Scrap metal was desperately needed for reconstruction. Beginning in late 1945 and accelerating through 1946, large-scale scrapping commenced. Contractors cut into wings and fuselages with torches. Engines were removed for resale or recycling. Aluminum skin was stripped and melted down. Control surfaces were stacked in piles. Within weeks, airframes that had taken months to build disappeared entirely. By 1947, thousands of Halifax bombers no longer existed in any physical form. Airfields once crowded with heavy aircraft returned to grass. Concrete runways cracked and weeded over. The bomber stations of Bomber Command entered a period of quiet abandonment. Strategically, the Halifax left little imprint on post-war doctrine. The RAF moved rapidly toward jet bombers such as the Canberra and later the V-4s. Nuclear deterrence replaced mass bomber streams. The lessons drawn from the Halifax era focused on industrial mobilization, crew survivability, and the limits of conventional bombing rather than on the aircraft itself. Historically, the Halifax occupied an uncomfortable position. It was neither the most famous nor the most technologically advanced British bomber. It lacked the iconic status of the Lancaster, despite comparable service. As a result, it was not prioritized for preservation. Only a handful of airframes survived in any form. Today, no complete original Halifax bomber remains intact and airworthy. A small number of reconstructed examples exist in museums assembled from recovered components, crash site remains, and restored parts. These represent thousands of aircraft through fragments rather than through continuity. The disappearance of the Halifax fleet was not the result of neglect, but of deliberate policy. Britain dismantled its wartime air power to survive economically and reposition strategically. In doing so, it erased much of the physical evidence of its bomber war within a single decade. The aircraft that once filled the night skies over Europe ended their lives quietly, cut apart in fields far from enemy fire. They did not crash in combat or fade through gradual obsolescence. They were removed because the world that required them had vanished. At that silent airfield in 1945, the Halifax bombers still looked formidable. Their wings cast long shadows in the evening light. Their fuselages bore mission markings, worn paint, and patched flak damage. But the war was over, and with it, their purpose. Within a few years, almost all would be gone.